Hello guys, Flanker here. This video is a detailed overview of the current state of Ashes of Creation MMORPG, approximately 1.5 months after the start of Alpha 2 Phase 2. At this point, I've spent more than 1,000 hours in Ashes of Creation during Phase 1, Phase 2, and on the PTR server. Therefore, I can finally provide a comprehensive review based on my experience. I will do my best to keep this video as unbiased as possible, highlighting both the positive and negative aspects of the game. If you're still unsure whether purchasing an Alpha 2 key is worth it, I hope this video helps you make an informed decision. Before we begin, I would appreciate it if you leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more Ashes of Creation content. As usual, shout out to my Twitch subs and YouTube sponsors. I'm really grateful for your kind support. Those who are already playing Ashes of Creation have heard this a million times, but this quick disclaimer is for those who haven't been following the game closely. Ashes of Creation is not a finished game and should not be treated as such. There are still at least 1.5 years of testing ahead, realistically even more, and there will be many changes, updates, and fixes, so keep that in mind.
That's why I always say testers, not players. You're not playing a game during this alpha phase. You are helping us test so that we can deliver to you the best product possible.
Currently, 6 out of 8 primary archetypes are available for players when creating a character: Mage, Cleric, Bard, Tank, Ranger, and Fighter. The first iteration of the Rogue archetype is expected to appear on the PTR server soon, while the last remaining archetype, Summoner, will be introduced at some point in Phase 3. Each archetype has a decent set of basic skills, but at this stage there isn't much room for creativity or build customization yet. Overall, all 6 archetypes are fully playable and have their uses in different scenarios. Some of them are more versatile and in higher demand. For example, support classes like Clerics and Bards are must-haves in almost any situation. When it comes to balance, some archetypes might have an advantage over others, especially in 1v1 scenarios. While some player concerns about balance are valid, it's important to remember that Ashes of Creation is primarily balanced around group play, not 1v1 combat. However, this may change to some extent in Phase 3 with the introduction of secondary archetypes and the skill augmentation system. The combat system in Ashes of Creation features a hybrid model, allowing players to switch between tap targeting and action combat. From what I've seen, most players tend to favor tap targeting, but that mostly depends on the player's archetype and personal preferences. In general, it is more likely to see a tank or a fighter choosing an action mode than a ranger or a mage. Overall, the combat itself in Ashes of Creation already feels pretty solid in both PvE and PvP, even at this stage of development. There is still plenty of room for polishing and refinement when it comes to animations, sound effects, and ability balancing. Personally, I'm quite satisfied with the current foundation of the combat system and look forward to seeing how it evolves throughout Alpha 2. In fact, this doesn't only apply to combat but to almost everything I see on the PTR server. It's quite interesting to watch the progression, for example seeing a new in-game system, mechanic, or content appear in the test environment in its first iteration, and then, after some time, being implemented on live servers in a much more polished version. This part of development often remains unnoticed by the broader audience, but based on what I've seen, Intrepid is currently putting in a lot of hard work. If you watch other content creators or read feedback from other players, you've probably seen opinions that leveling and progression in Ashes of Creation feel somewhat grindy, and this isn't far from the truth.
Because we don't have quests right now, and we only have grinding in the open world, how do you feel about time invested per level gained by the player? Because the way that I felt about it so far is it is quite long, and that's not for everyone, but I do feel very positively when I gain that level. But I can't understand from the other perspective of like somebody doesn't have a huge amount of time, what does that feel like for them?
That's a super fair assessment of the current leveling experience. Probably our most completed core loop is the combat experience. Engaging with the archetype, fighting with monsters and encounters. Like that is, I believe right now, our most compelling, indicative, full feature focus of a gameplay loop. What we're missing during Phase 1, and we fully, knew this, and we tried to express this outwardly, are those narrative components, are the artisanship progression paths. They are the social organizations and the religions, like all of these separate progression paths that give you adventuring experience when you do them as well, but also have the power to influence the world in ways equal to, or in some cases greater than, what adventuring leveling does. So right now it feels a bit overtuned towards like monster grinding because that content isn't yet in the game, and that's what Phase 2 and Phase 3 are going to represent.
To be fair, I would say that leveling in Phase 1 and at the start of Phase 2 wasn't all that different. The most effective way to reach the max level was still grinding mobs. Overall, players reached level 25 in Phase 2 faster, which is not surprising. Many had experience from Phase 1, and there were already leveling guides available on YouTube. It's hard not to agree with Thor and Steven here. The more possible ways there are to gain experience in the game, the higher the chance that the average player will find a path they enjoy without falling too far behind. Ashes of Creation has already attracted, and will continue to attract, players from different games and with various gaming backgrounds. It is crucial for the game to accommodate new players and provide a variety of progression and content loops to keep them engaged. At the same time, it's important to understand that while Intrepid actively considers players' feedback, the core design pillars and game philosophy will not change.
But I will say, we will be on the grindier side of what probably most modern MMO players are accustomed to. That is a bit of a callback to a more old school approach, of which you will find many callbacks in, the design for Ashes.
At this moment, casual and solo players might be having a tough time, but it's fair to point out that their experience is currently the hardest it will ever be compared to all future testing phases. Essentially, if you have managed to survive in the world of Verra now, you'll definitely be fine moving forward.
On the content side, you want to make sure that those things are solid first. Throughout Phase 2, we're going to continue to see content come online, and Phase 3 is really where the content should shine.
Speaking of open world dungeons, the experience of being in them can feel quite different from other games. It's not your typical run through a series of rooms, kill a few named mobs, fight the raid boss in the end, and then leave. While that approach is still possible, the average dungeon grinding session is more like find a good, uncontested area with enough ordinary mobs, and a few named mobs spawning nearby, then farm them for a while, and that's about it. Personally, I'm used to this kind of grinding, but I completely understand why some players find a more static farm repetitive and monotonous. However, let's not forget that 20% of the game's content will be instanced, and this is expected to be introduced in Phase 3 as well. Those who prefer isolated dungeons where other players can't interfere with their gameplay will finally be able to enjoy the type of content they prefer. Lastly, there are currently 2 world bosses in the game, Tumok and Firebrand. Both have a solid foundation and decent mechanics, but at this point, many players are already overgeared for them. At the same time, it's important to acknowledge that farming any boss is usually challenging the first few times, but then it inevitably becomes routine. From my experience, world bosses are the most fun when multiple guilds are contesting them. Currently, the boss fight itself might only last a few minutes, but the PvP beforehand can go on for half an hour or more, often leading to several guild war declarations that persist long after the boss is dead. It might be an unpopular opinion, but I think it would be perfect if certain areas around world bosses were PvP zones, ensuring that anyone who wants to claim precious loot has the opportunity for a fair fight. PvP in Ashes of Creation is designed to be dynamic, large-scale, and deeply integrated into the game's core loops. With open-world PvP, guild wars, caravans, and other systems, there are many opportunities for players to engage in combat against one another. The flagging and corruption system helps regulate open-world PvP by discouraging random player killing and griefing. During Alpha 2, the consequences of going corrupted are significantly harsher compared to what they will be after release, as this helps maintain a more controlled testing environment.
We're also in a temporary phase of development being in alpha, where a lot of player perspective on their gear potential loss and or progression loss that corruption is supposed to deter for is just not as strong hitting in an alpha environment where people are willing to lose their characters. So in that sense, we're gonna balance a little bit, perhaps overbalance for corruption during the testing period, and then as we enter into more permanent phases of testing, such as Alpha Phase 2 and Alpha Phase 3 or Beta, that's where we feel we can take the reins off a little bit.
I would say that the PvP aspect of the game has a truly insane potential, but at the moment it still requires a lot of work. This applies to several key areas, including server performance in large-scale battles, adjustments to the average time to kill, and fixing various bugs that affect the overall PvP experience.
But I think a lot of us are finding that if you just enchant the shit out of level 10 gear,
Correct, yeah.
you just can scale that to where you're now back to 3-tapping people. Everyone wants to know, they're asking, when could they expect this to maybe be looked at that or fixed, or I guess even just acknowledged?
I was in a meeting this last week where we discussed TTK. We're aware of it. We see it. There will be some changes that will likely come out within the next 2 weeks that will address the current enchantment issues. I would wait a couple weeks on that because the design team needs to think about how to approach this. And again, this is the purpose of testing. This is why we test. You can have something on paper and you can have models that display what the trajectory of a particular system might include. And then when it hits the hands of players, you can see the outcome in a real environment be different than what was expected on paper. And that's when you balance. So that's the whole purpose of alpha.
There was a similar situation back in Phase 1 when high rarity gear was too overpowered, and Intrepid addressed that issue. I expect the same to happen now as we face a different challenge. Personally, I believe that this situation arose because the game currently has only 8 nodes. As a result, players can't build all the necessary workstations for crafting and enchanting tier 3 gear. I have little doubt that if there were more nodes, this problem wouldn't have even existed in the first place. Despite the fact that many PvP-related systems, such as node and castle sieges, arenas, and naval combat, are not in the game yet, it wasn't difficult to find PvP during Phase 2 if you were looking for it. The vast majority of my fights happened while attacking or defending caravans. We also had a lot of fun during guild wars, organized PvP events, and scrims. Based on my experience, I've come to the conclusion that PvP in Ashes of Creation is easy to learn but hard to master, especially in group versus group scenarios. Gathering, processing, and crafting serve as essential elements of the player-driven economy in Ashes of Creation. Same as with many other systems in-game, the foundation is decent, and I'm looking forward to seeing how this gameplay loop will evolve over time to its final form. 22 artisan professions, their synergy and necessity to specialize in a few of them to be able to craft the best items, all that definitely sounds like a good start. Meanwhile, there are a couple of issues that many players expect to be addressed at some point. When it comes to gathering, for example, the static locations and predictable respawn times of resource nodes are a problem. In a perfect world, gathering should involve exploring the wilderness and finding resources, not camping some of them with a timer. In the long run, this could potentially encourage dishonest players to use bots, which is something that should be prevented. However, to be completely fair, there are a lot of placeholders in gathering, processing, and crafting systems. They act as temporary but functional solutions, and this may be an example of one of them. Overall, as expected, crafted gear is the best gear in the game. This in turn creates demand for gatherers who collect resources and processors who refine them. Crafting high rarity items usually requires a significant amount of effort, but finally equipping a new legendary piece of gear feels genuinely rewarding. In conclusion, it's important to note that a significant portion of the player base finds gathering, processing, and crafting to be engaging and appealing gameplay loops. These systems are among those that Intrepid must get right and ensure they function seamlessly in the long run. Doing so could attract a large number of players who don't prioritize PvP content, but still want to find their place in the world of Verra and play a meaningful role in its economy and progression. The economy in Ashes of Creation is entirely player-driven, meaning that supply, demand, and regional availability of items and resources are dictated solely by the actions of the players. Player trading in Phase 2 has become much more active compared to Phase 1. One of the key factors contributing to this was the introduction of marketplaces in each of the nodes. Even though this is just the first iteration, and marketplaces are still in a rough state, they have significantly stimulated trade in both items and resources. However, there is an important issue that many players have mentioned in a recent weekly feedback request, namely the lack of search filters on the marketplace. Having proper filters wouldn't just save players a huge amount of time, but it would also turn trading into a full-fledged gameplay loop. I fully understand that quality of life features are not a priority at the moment, but in my subjective opinion, this particular one is extremely important. This wouldn't just make life easier for players and save them from scrolling through hundreds of player shops, but it would also increase the amount of taxes flowing into the node treasuries, which in turn would accelerate their development. But yeah, let's not forget that we are still in the alpha phase and this will change sooner or later.
What are some of the ideas that you guys have for improving market stalls, improving the marketplace functionality? Because It's very bare bones right now, but we're so happy for the bare bones market stalls. Honestly, it's really nice to have at least that system in the game.
There's a lot that needs to be done for market stalls. The team that's responsible for market stalls also has a lot to be done on the resource topics that we've talked about in the past and the artisanship stations that we talked about in the past, because that's all the econ engineering and econ design team. So they have some competing priorities. So keep that in mind. We want to obviously significantly add to the search functionality of the system so that you can search by material type. We need to touch up the UX because that was very kind of hastily done and bare bones. And then also we need to think about long-term how that system can share with the auction house, the intended auction house, but also service, remember, these foundations with the stall and the marketplace systems as well. So, short story, we have a lot to do on UX and we have a lot to do on search functionality for the marketplace, but as it stands now, it's at least satisfying a method by which, being offline, you can actually trade goods.
Overall, the economic gameplay loop looks very promising. I have no doubt that in later testing stages and after the game's release, there will be players who make a lot of gold without even leaving a note, simply because they have mastered the art of trading. And when it comes to the economy itself, I don't know much about the situation on other servers, but on Lotharia it seems to be relatively healthy. We didn't have any serious dupes or exploits, at least to the best of my knowledge, and at this point it seems that there are enough gold sinks in place to prevent high inflation. The node system is probably one of the most ambitious and defining features of Ashes of Creation. Like many other systems, nodes are currently in a functional state, providing only basic features and still far from their final iteration. It is still possible to build tier 2 and tier 3 workstations, provided there is enough gold in the node treasury and players contribute the necessary resources. At the same time, some players completely ignore this aspect of the game, while others point out that completing buy orders created by mayors doesn't make much sense, as they often lose more than they gain in return. One way or another, it would be nice if players were given more incentives to actively participate in node development. During phase 1, only 5 nodes were available, while at the start of phase 2, this number increased to 8. Despite some players' dissatisfaction that the 3 new desert nodes weren't significantly different from the existing ones, this was still a very important change. First of all, with the map expansion, these 3 new nodes created additional caravan routes. Without them, finding and raiding caravans would have been too easy. Secondly, even 8 nodes are not enough to build all necessary tier 3 workstations, and if there were only 5, the situation would be even worse. And finally, more players had the opportunity to try their hand at being node mayors. Overall, the vast majority of features related to node development can be expected throughout the phase 3 that begins on the May 1st. Unlike many other MMOs where solo play is a viable long-term option, Ashes of Creation places a strong emphasis on player-driven interactions. There are many scenarios where players need to work together to achieve their goals, whether it's forming parties to farm a dungeon or joining a guild to contest world bosses. In general, joining a guild can completely transform your gameplay experience and grant access to content that may be unavailable to solo players. Difficult dungeons that require well-coordinated teamwork, safer caravan runs, access to guild crafters, and many other benefits become available to players in most guilds. Moreover, who knows, some of your guildmates might even become good friends in the future. To be honest, the social aspect of Ashes of Creation, even at this stage, brings back the vibe of old-school MMO games. Players looking for groups in chat, occasional drama and conflicts, politics and propaganda, all of this reminds me of my good old days in Lineage 2. As for politics, this aspect of the game will definitely be huge, which is actually awesome because it's something that essentially never ends. When it comes to feedback from the community, one topic that comes up from time to time is communication from Intrepid Studios. It's no secret that open development requires a much more serious and transparent approach to communication compared to the traditional development process that most studios follow. Additionally, the situation is further complicated by the vast difference in audience awareness. There are players who followed the project for years, and there are also those who only learned about the game last week. In my opinion, communication can always be better or worse, but it will never be perfect. No matter what you do, there will always be people on the internet who criticize you for almost anything. That is just the reality, and there isn't much that can be done about it. However, even though perfection is unattainable, that doesn't mean that there is no room for improvement. There have been a few instances in the past where Intrepid could have handled situations or communicated things better. Mistakes are inevitable in any field, and in my opinion, what really matters is how often they they happen, how serious they are, and how the studio responds to them. At the same time, I would say that there are certain things we, as a community, have gotten used to and no longer see as exceptional, even though they are not that common in the development process of other studios. We have regular interviews with Steven, monthly development live streams, Steven occasionally streaming on Twitch, Intrepid actively collecting player feedback on Discord, test session on the BTR server, and more. The only thing we don't have anymore is office hours, but let's be honest, how many of you actually participated in them at least once? Overall, I would probably rate the current communication quality around 7 out of 10, but once again, this is just my subjective opinion and it may be different from yours. The question, is it worth buying and playing the game now, will likely remain relevant all the way until release.
A good gut check when you think about whether you really want to play is if you put it in the context of saying, I want to play, then you're probably not wanting to test.
Yeah.
And right now, this is very much a test, not a game yet. Phase 3, we're going to see a lot of progress towards the bugs that still exist and the performance of the game. So you lose nothing by just participating as a viewer, giving your feedback on the systems and experiences that you're watching, that you're still able to be a part of the development. And then we don't have a box price when we launch. So, that's something that you can continue to look forward to.
There are several factors that should be considered when making this decision. First and foremost, the financial aspect. Alpha 2 keys cost around $100, and if that's a significant amount of money for you, then the answer is obvious. You shouldn't buy it. Secondly, and yes, I know you've probably heard this many times, but the game is still in the testing phase. There will be wipes, a lot of content is still missing, and there are various bugs and issues. This may not be a fun experience for someone who expects to play a finished game, because it's not a finished game. Thirdly, if you have never played similar games that embrace the risk versus reward concept as a core design pillar, or if you've never played MMOs at all, it would be much more reasonable to wait. This way, you won't ruin your first impression of the game and can objectively assess whether or not you actually enjoy this type of MMO. Finally, if you're still hesitating, try looking at it from a different perspective and ask yourself the following question. Is it worth buying an Alpha 2 key, or would I get more value for my money by purchasing 2-3 other games on Steam? Now, if what I just said didn't discourage you and you're still considering joining Phase 2, here's something you might want to know. Depending on how many hours per day you're willing to dedicate to the game and what aspects interest you, at this point, Ashes of Creation can keep you entertained for about 1 to 2 months. At the moment, there isn't a huge amount of content, so for most players, it's unlikely to be their main game. Overall, to an average player, I would recommend to join either in Phase 3, when more content will be available, or wait until release when the game will transition to a subscription-only model. If this video was interesting, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. I am Flanker, and I'll see you soon.